Can you really get $1 million of sexual abuse liability coverage for a children's home? Absolutely. But here's the problem. Most organizations are asking the wrong insurance companies, presenting themselves the wrong way, and accidentally giving underwriters reasons to say no before they've even reviewed the account. So today, I'll show you how to avoid all of that. But before we jump into the steps, think about what happens when you apply for a mortgage. The bank isn't calling you a bad person because they ask for your income, your credit score, and your employment history. They're simply trying to figure out how likely it is that they'll lose money. Insurance companies do exactly the same thing, but instead of asking whether you'll repay a loan, they're asking whether your organization has the people, policies, and supervision in place to prevent one of the most severe claims they can insure. So once you start looking at the application through the underwriter's eyes instead of your own, their questions start making a whole lot more sense. And that's exactly what we're going to cover next, because getting to $1 million abuse limit isn't about luck. It's about showing the insurance company that your organization is a risk they can confidently insure. If your goal is to get a children's home approved so your state can start placing children with you, the very first hurdle is talking to the right insurance companies. And this is where a lot of organizations unintentionally waste weeks or even months. They start calling local insurance agents or requesting quotes online only to hear things like, "We don't write children's homes," or "the most we can offer is $100,000 of abuse and molestation coverage." The problem is, if your state requires $1 million limit, neither of those answers get you where you need to go. The reality is there are only a handful of insurance companies in the country that have an appetite for children's homes while also being willing to offer a $1 million abuse and molestation limit. So before you spend time comparing prices, the first question should be, am I talking to companies that can actually solve my problem? There's one more thing that's important here. Don't assume that every policy offering a $1 million limit is identical. Ask whether volunteers are covered, whether defense costs reduce the limit, and whether there are any restrictions that could weaken the protection you're buying. Two policies may say $1 million on the declarations page, but the wording behind those limits may be very different. Once you've identified insurance companies that are actually capable of writing your organization, you cleared the first hurdle. Now you have to convince them that your account is worth quoting. And that's where most organizations either gain momentum or lose it completely. Once you've found insurance companies that are willing to offer this coverage, the next challenge is getting them to actually spend time on your account. And believe it or not, that's not automatic. Insurance companies receive far more submissions than they can realistically quote. So underwriters have to make decisions every day about which accounts deserve their attention. If a submission looks incomplete, disorganized, or like it's being shot by a half dozen different brokers, they are much less likely to invest the time. That's why I always recommend appointing one broker to represent you in the marketplace. When 5 different brokers approach the same insurance company for this exact same account, it creates confusion. The underwriter doesn't know who's actually representing you, and many carriers will simply work with whichever broker contacted them first, or they may decide not to engage at all. I'd like to tell my clients that abuse coverage is often won in the submission before it's won in the quote. The better your organization is presented, the easier it is for an underwriter to say, "This is an account I want to work on." A strong submission is more than just a completed application. It should clearly explain your program, including your loss history, describe the children you serve, outline your staffing ratios and the supervision model, provide your licensing information, and summarize the safeguarding procedures you have in place to protect the children. The goal is to make it easy for the underwriter to understand your organization without having to chase you for information. Think back to the mortgage example we talked about earlier. The bank is much more comfortable approving a loan when everything is organized and clearly documented. Insurance companies are no different. The easier you make their job, the more confidence they have in your organization. Once you've earned an underwriter's attention, the next question they're going to ask is, who exactly are the children this organization serves? And that answer has a huge impact on whether they'll offer the coverage at all. Once an underwriter decides your submission is worth reviewing, one of the first things you're going to look at is who you're serving. And this is one of the biggest underwriting decisions in the entire process. Not all children's homes look the same from an insurance company's perspective. Some organizations work with children who simply need a safe, stable place to live because of family circumstances. Others work with youth who have significant behavioral challenges or a history of violence. From an underwriting standpoint, those are very different risks. Many insurance companies have what's called an underwriting appetite. In other words, they've decided ahead of time what types of organizations they're comfortable insuring and which ones they aren't. If your program serves children with a history of violent behavior, chronic fire setting, or known sexual offenses, many carriers will simply decline the account. Those are hard stops for a lot of insurance companies. Now, for most children's homes, that isn't the population they're serving, but it's important not to assume the underwriter knows that. Your job is to paint a clear picture of the program. Explain who you serve, describe your admission criteria, talk about the level of care you provide and the supervision your residents receive. The goal isn't to make your program sound better than it is, it's to make sure the insurance company accurately understands the level of risk they're evaluating. I've seen organizations leave out important details simply because they assume they weren't relevant. Unfortunately, when underwriters don't have enough information, they often fill in the blanks with assumptions, and in insurance, assumptions usually don't work in your favor. Once the underwriter understands that your client population fits within their appetite, the next question becomes even more important. Have you built the safeguards necessary to prevent abuse from happening in the first place? That's where your policies, procedures, and day-to-day operations become just as important as the insurance application itself. Even if an insurance company is comfortable with the population you serve, they're still going to ask one more question. What are you doing every single day to prevent abuse from happening? This is where your policies and procedures become incredibly important because insurance companies aren't just underwriting your organizations. They're underwriting your safeguarding systems. They're going to want to know how you screen employees before they're ever hired. Do you perform criminal background checks? Do you conduct face-to-face interviews? Do you verify references? Those are all things that help reduce the chances of hiring someone who shouldn't be working around vulnerable children. Next, they're going to look at supervision. One of the biggest red flags for underwriters is situations where an employee or volunteer can be alone with a child without accountability. That's why many insurance companies want to see policies that limit one-on-one interactions whenever possible, require appropriate supervision, and make sure staff members are visible to one another throughout the day. They'll also want to understand your staffing model. Is there 24-hour supervision? How are overnight shifts handled? How are incidents documented? If a child makes an allegation, what's the reporting process? Who gets notified and how quickly? Remember the mortgage analogy from earlier. A bank asks for proof that you can repay the loan. An insurance company asks for proof that you've built systems designed to protect children. They're not expecting perfection because no organization is perfect. What they want to see is that you've thoughtfully designed your program to reduce opportunities for abuse and that your staff knows exactly what to do if something ever happens. The stronger those controls are and the better you can document them, the more confidence an underwriter is going to have in offering your organization the coverage you need. Now, let's finish with one mistake I see organizations make after they've worked so hard to obtain this coverage because it's something that can create problems down the road if you're not careful. There's one last thing I want to mention because I've seen organizations spend a tremendous amount of time getting this coverage in place only to accidentally create a problem later when they switch insurance companies. Sexual abuse claims are different from many other types of insurance claims. In some cases, an allegation isn't reported until years or even decades after the alleged abuse occurred. That's why it's important to be careful anytime you change insurance carriers. If you decide to move your coverage, ask your broker one simple question. Will this change affect my prior act's coverage or my retroactive date? You don't need to become an insurance expert, but you do want to make sure there isn't a gap between your old policy and your new one. The last thing you want to find out years later is that a claim isn't covered because those dates weren't handled correctly during the transition. So if you remember nothing else from this video, remember these 5 things. First, make sure you're approaching insurance companies that actually offer $1 million of abuse and molestation limits for children's homes. Second, present your organization through one broker with a complete, well-organized submission. Third, clearly explain the population you serve so the underwriter understands your actual level of risk. 4, document the safeguard systems you've built to protect the children in your care. And finally, if you ever change insurance companies, make sure your prior acts coverage and retroactive dates are protected. If you get those 5 things right, you'll put your organization in the strongest possible position to obtain the $1 million sexual abuse liability coverage that so many state licensing agencies require. One thing I didn't spend much time talking about in this video is why it's become so difficult to find $1 million of sexual abuse liability coverage in the first place. If you've noticed premiums increasing, fewer insurance companies offering the coverage, or lower limits than you could get just a few years ago, there's a reason for it. It all comes back to 3 major legal trends that are changing the insurance marketplace across the country and making these claims more expensive than ever for insurance companies to defend and settle. Click right here, and I'll walk you through exactly what's happening and what it means for your organization. I'll see you there.